My name's Kayla. I'm the Service, Urban, and Recreation Forester for the William Penn State Forest, which covers the southeastern 9 counties. It's District 17, so from Northampton, Lehigh, Berks, and Lancaster to the Delaware. I cover Montgomery, Philadelphia, Delaware, and the eastern half of Chester, which is a lot. So I work in the forestry side. There's 20 forest districts in Pennsylvania, and there's about 126 state parks. That encompasses about 2.2 million acres of public lands that the state owns and provides resources and recreation for everybody. So I'm a little busy. It's good though. We have to take care of those tracts of land we get. We do active timber sales all across the state. We do timber sales down here, but they're different. They're more of a salvage effort. Most of the properties that we do get tend to have been high graded, meaning all the good trees were taken and all the poorly formed suppressed trees are left, just because some landowners like to get as much money for their property before they sell it. So we try to rehabilitate all that. But the timber industry in Pennsylvania is a huge economic boom for the state. And the state does do upwards of $20 million a year worth of timber sales, but it's done sustainably, especially in the northern districts where they have hundreds of thousands of acres to manage.
So right now we're going to kind of go down this Scouts loop around here, and then I think we'll take the switch back down.
Here, if you look up, they're pretty sparse as far as the fine twigs and stuff. So if you look at trees, like some of the oaks and stuff have a lot more really fine twigs, but with the ash and the emerald ash borer, the trees do like what we call epicormic branching, where the trees are really stressed out because of the insect. So they're putting out branches and leaves wherever they can to try to like build their resources back up. So if you see ash that still have the leaves on them, it's really key to look where the leaves are coming from, because they'll be closer and closer to the stem of the tree, the trunk, which kind of just is, it knows it's dying, but it's not quite dead yet. So it's unfortunate. We can't really do anything about it. They can be treated, but that just kind of prolongs the inevitable. So we're working on it. But there's no lack of ash regeneration in the forest. It's everywhere. So hopefully it can like survive the tide of the bug. Unfortunately, there's kind of really wouldn't be any immunity to an insect per se, unless it evolved into something that the insect didn't like, but that's obviously a very long time from happening. So it's more of trying to find ways of controlling the insect, or hoping when the ash population dies out that the insect kind of will, and that there'll be a kind of like an ebb and flow through the years of like high populations of insects, but we don't really know. It's still out in Michigan. It's been in the country for 20 years now, so we're working on it. But there's lots of biological controls and releases, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to control everything either, because with the biological control there could be issues with that. So there's a lot of research still going on. But
the ash borer is an invasive?
Yeah, it came from China on a wood pallet that wasn't properly fumigated, came into Michigan and just kind of worked its way east. So it's pretty much devastated the entire anything in the ash family completely. But they only go for ash, white, green, red, and black. So it's not something that we found on any other species of tree, which is good in a way. If there's a positive to it, that would be it. They only like ash. So unlike the spy lanternfly that likes literally everything. But then the lanternfly doesn't necessarily kill the tree either. So it's just more of a nuisance pest.
So does it have any natural predators yet?
For the lanternfly or the ash borer?
The ash borer.
There's some wasps that parasitize the eggs, but a lot of them we've brought in too, and there's research with that. And when I say wasp, I mean they're super, super tiny. Yeah. So as we're walking here, you can see a lot of the smaller plants that still have green on them are the invasive species. They're always the first to green up in the spring and the last to change in the fall. So you can kind of get an idea. I mean, there are invasives that I usually don't mind too much unless they control everything. And this is Himalayan wineberry. If anybody's seen them, they're like little golden raspberries and they're delicious. So kind of give and take on that. I am always a key advocate of like everything in moderation. We know we can't eradicate the invasive species, so we might as well like work with them the best we can. So when I see things like wineberry in a stand, as long as it's not completely blanketing everything, I'm like, just leave it. It'll provide you some sort of benefit. They're delicious. So
how do you distinguish that from the poison ivy?
So this, the stem is super hairy and it's got thorns on it. And
Poison ivy doesn't.
no, poison ivy's hairy, but it's a vine, so it'll crawl up the trees and stuff. This is just a freestanding shrub. So, and this will be in big
Poison
clumps.
ivy isn't that sometimes?
It can be a ground cover, but usually when it gets to a certain point, it starts to vine. So unless it's been cut repeatedly, I've seen spots of poison ivy where people keep cutting it down and it's a giant shrub because it was once a vine that they kept cutting down. But that's not overly common. If you're gonna see it, it's gonna be like this tall as a ground cover until it gets mature and starts vining up.
We do know, I think, from research and maybe photos, that the shingle trail, these plantings are actually relatively new. Before that, this would have been a dairy farm.
Right.
So no fear of bears for several hundred years on this side.
Yeah, so if you, it was Penn Pilot. I don't remember what it is anymore. They changed it, but it had aerial photos all the way back to like the 30s of the surrounding like city areas, and all of Greater Philadelphia was farming. And then everybody went to war, they came back, they decided they didn't want to farm anymore and let the land just grow up as what it is. So it's pretty interesting to look and see how clear everything used to be. Plus, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Pennsylvania was almost entirely clear cut. So there was only a few pockets that had like standing trees left. And I mean, you could look on the mountains going up north and there wouldn't be a tree anywhere.
That's great perspective because I would have no knowledge of that history. And it's not all that long ago. But I
No, it's
have
not.
no knowledge of it.
Pennsylvania, and Williamsport, Pennsylvania in particular, where I'm from, it was the logging capital of the world at one point in the late 1800s. So it's pretty intense. The Susquehanna River would be nothing but logs. You could walk all the way across it without even touching water at different points. And they still dredge logs out that have sunk down into the riverbed. And with the clear cut, there was almost no deer left in the state either. The deer population we had is only probably over 100 years old. But you think there's no trees, there's no support for any sort of wildlife. So Pennsylvania has made a massive turnaround in the last 150 years.
We do have a number of, thank goodness, we do have a number of hemlocks, Suga canadensis, which is our state tree. Still, even though we're losing them like crazy, as climate change happens, you know.
Their range extends further north. So it's very rare to find eastern hemlock this far south unless it's in ravines and along creeks is where they should be. But if you go up north, like my woods at home is basically a monoculture of eastern hemlock, which is still relatively healthy, which I'm happy about. But they're definitely a northern species, and they're incredibly important for our streams and stream health because they provide shade and keep the stream really cool, and they're great at filtering out of streams too to keep them quality. So without the hemlock, we're trying to find replacement. Norway's always been on the table for it, even though it's not native because it does grow well. But it's definitely something to think about, especially with our temperatures warming. It's pushing a lot of our species further north and potentially, way down the line out of the state entirely, and more of an influx of southern species.
And with that, the insects and birds that follow those particular plants and trees, right?
Yep. So down here, we've also lost a lot of different oak species, and we're just calling it a general oak decline. We've had pathologists out to look at things. So there's a lot of different factors. There's a really good graph. It's just like a spiral effect where the tree has a really wet year and then a year of drought, and then that causes stress, and then trees send out hormones that they're stressed, and then bugs are like, oh, it's stressed out, and it's just this spiral of death, which is sad, but these things happen, especially when we have a lot of rain. Like 2018 was an incredibly wet year, but you don't see the effects of that until a couple years later. So everything with trees is incredibly slow, unless it's oak wilt, and then that's really, really fast. But they haven't found it east of the Susquehanna River yet. It's still in the western part of the state. Oak wilt will kill a tree in months. Wow. It's incredibly fast. More of the red oak family. The white oak seems to be a little more resistant to it. It's relatively easy to control once you find it. It's just removing all the trees around it too, because it's spread by root grafting. So hopefully we don't get it, but it really hasn't devastated the western part of the state at all. So, but it's just something to be concerned about. Oaks are incredibly important to the environment, especially for insect species. They support over 500 different kinds of insects just on, you know, a red oak itself. So, and also just water, like keeping water out, wet sites, things like that. I mean, they can suck up hundreds of gallons of water. So they're incredibly important. And then they're one of our longer lived trees in the state too. So all trees like different amounts of water. They have tolerance levels for everything. So things like sycamore and river birch you're going to find near rivers because they can handle a lot of water. And then things like red oak, we call them kind of like a mid-slope tree. They can handle water to a point, and they can handle more dry. They're kind of that midline. White oak you'll find like kind of downslope a little bit more. And then things like chestnut oak and scarlet oak you'll find at the tops of mountains. They like dry, barren soil. They can handle that really well. So all trees like different levels of moisture, nutrients, sunlight, things like that. So when forests and things grow, there's different levels, especially with elevation. Your tree species will change drastically from like the lowlands all the way up to the upland communities and up to the top of the mountain. So when we're looking at red oak, they're really good in areas like this, but you're not generally going to find it down by a river. You know, you might find white oaks more down that way. So it's just when you're thinking about planting trees, you have to think about all of these different factors too. Like red oak are moderately shade tolerant to a certain point, then they like full sun, or you get species like tulip poplar that are pioneer species, and you can consider them a climax species. Pioneer means they'll grow up immediately. They like full sun, they're really good, but they're also the mature species in our forest, which would be the climax species, the top, that are going to stay around for a long time. So there's a lot of factors that come into play on what kind of trees you're looking at planting, especially in areas like this. So, you know, all trees take different amounts of water, nutrients, things like that. All right, so like while we're like on tree ID and stuff, this is probably one of my favorite trees. It's sassafras. It has 3 leaves, 3 different leaf shapes on a tree. Here's the sassafras right here. Darker, really rigid bark, has really deep furrows. You can make tea out of it. Leaves, we've got a turkey foot, a mitten, and then just the oval. It could have all of them, it could have 1, it could have 2, it just really depends. But usually when you see, you know, 2 different leaves, you're gonna know it's the sassafras. If you break a branch off and smell it, it kind of smells like Fruit Loops to me. So that's the neat thing about, you know, learn how different ways to identify trees. You've got opposite, alternate, world. The only species that's world that's native to Pennsylvania is Catalpa. Cigar tree, some people call it. And then, you know, your buds, the bark, the leaves, but you've got smell too. In some cases, you probably could have taste, like birch. Birch smells peppermint, like or wintergreen. All the birches have a faint wintergreen smell. Black birch has the most. That's where birch beer comes from. If anybody's had birch beer soda, it's probably my favorite. Definitely more of a northern thing, I think.
Whiskey, sell it at the farmer's market.
Ah, well, I'll have to check that out. That would be amazing. I grew up on birch beer, so it's pretty cool. So, yeah, sassafras. This tree, well, right here's a good one. This is an invasive species. We do have a native. The only way to tell them apart is by the flowers. The native's more of a northern, kind of northwestern part of the state. This is Japanese Aralia. It is a horrible tree. It's usually the only thing around you when you're falling. And I say that because there's massive thorns on it. And I have seen them where the thorns are 2-3 inches long, and I have put them very deep into my hand times before. Even the leaves. So this is the leaf like we talked about, compound. This one's a little different. It's like double pinnately compound. So you've got the main stem. So this whole thing is the leaf. When you're doing compound leaves and versus simple leaves, the best way to do it is where the leaf attaches. If you follow that back to where it attaches to the stem and there is not a bud at the base of it, then it's a compound leaf. So I broke this off. If I break this guy off, there's no bud at the base of it. But if I follow all this back where I broke it off, there's a bud right where that leaf scar is. It's very small right now. So there are always exceptions to the rules. The opposite and alternate, we use an acronym called MAD horse, M-A-D, and then horse. So the M is maple, A is ash, D is dogwood, and then horse is horse chestnut. If you find an opposite tree, it's one of those species, unless it's invasive. So Aralia grows super fast. It can grow 5, 6, 10 feet in a season. It's very hard to kill. More than likely, if you have a massive population of it, you will have to use chemical control.
This is bad other than for humans?
It's bad because the Aralia can take over an entire stand, and it can completely drown out anything native that's growing. So there's difference between invasive and like in ornamental. Ornamentals generally don't escape out into the wilderness. When it becomes invasive is when it has negative effects on the natural ecosystem. So this is highly invasive. There's also Norway maple, which is in here for sure, I'm pretty sure. Looking around, maybe. I think this is one right here. If I can see the lead. Yeah, so then this is Norway maple. Norway maple is also an invasive species. And this big tree right here, and it can take over an entire stand too and just block out the sunlight from natural regeneration. John Bartram brought this in a long time ago. I don't know the dates, thinking it'd be a really great tree, and it kind of is for street trees. Usually you see them as like deep purple or red leaves. Crimson King or Queen, I always mix it up. I'm still learning my ornamentals. There's so many. But Norway maple can take over a stand. So the leaves kind of look like a sugar maple if you're not overly familiar, but there are key differences between the two. Also, if you break off a leaf from the Norway maple, especially in the spring and summer, and squeeze it, it'll exude a white sap like milkweed. And none of the other maples do that. You can still tap it for maple syrup. Doesn't taste as good. It takes a lot of syrup, but because it is still a maple, but it's an invasive one. So
In this part of the country, because of the deer pressure we have, we are losing that understory layer, which is critical for the birds and other habitat for other animals. So if you look through here in the winter, all you'll see is no leaves and green, and that green is generally the Japanese honeysuckle and any number of evergreen invasive plants that have taken over. All plants are native somewhere. It's not the plant's fault. We love every kind of plant there is, but when homeowners are not, and of course they haven't been educated, when you're not aware of what is invasive, check the Pennsylvania invasive plant list before you put anything in your home garden.
So we're talking about the deer and how we manage our properties on state forests. We always go by what we call the CDL, which is competing vegetation, deer, and light. Those are the three things you have to actively manage to have a healthy, sustainable forest. So competing vegetation would be the Aralia. Light is maybe there's way too much of a really dense canopy and we need to do some harvest to clear that out. We usually call it like a shelter wood. We take some nice mature trees, we take some of the suppressed kind of junky trees because we want good genetics within the stand. And we do it like in a scientific way. There's a science behind it. It's silviculture, different applications for different kinds of species and stands and what our end results are. Sometimes, and it does happen, a clear cut is absolutely needed because it is nothing but invasives and very poorly formed trees, or maybe it's a monoculture, which we don't want. You know, if you drive down the street and all you see is like white ash down the street, but they're all dead now. So you kind of want that really high diversity of planting. So if there is an impact on disease with insects or anything, you still have a lot of other species to fill in those gaps. So when we do things, sometimes I've done where, you know, we've had to do an entire clear cut and reset the stand, invigorate the seed bed and try to get new things to come up because it just been harvested so poorly for so long. And usually those applications that we do with the clear cutting is for properties that we've acquired, like I talked about earlier with the high grading, where they took all the good stuff and left the bad trees, the more repressed, suppressed trees, things like that. So there is a time and a place for everything. But when we're talking about controlling the wild and, you know, helping a stand regenerate properly, it's deer is the biggest control, especially down here, but competing vegetation and light. So there's a lot of different things to think about. And with us walking downhill and the aspect and things like that, aspect is the way the slope faces and which way the sun hits the slope. So a southern facing slope is going to be a lot more dry, gets the sun more, and a north facing slope isn't going to have the sun as much and it retains a lot more moisture. So there are some good pictures online where you'll see two slopes come together and you'll see the drainage in the middle and you can tell instantly what side the sun is hitting. So all of that comes into play when we're thinking about how we want to manage a forest. All right, so we've come down the bottom of the hill, and if you've been kind of noticing, like when we're up top, there's a lot more oak, like up top on the park in the grass setting, and then as we've come down, the species have changed some more. So we still have some ash. Ash is more of a lowland species. They like more wet feet, swamps, things like that. But now we're getting into our sycamore. So right there, the tree that like the bark looks like it's peeling and it's got white on the top of it. So we've got, that's a wetland indicator. It's a species that likes wet feet. So we're seeing that down here more. So I wanted to stop here and talk about the American beech, which is these two. They're an incredibly important tree for our ecosystem. They have beech nuts. They're great for wildlife. If you would cut the tree, they like to what we call root sucker, so they can get kind of angry and just send up a lot of other shoots. So they can be very thick and brushy. But beech is really important for our ecosystem. They provide really good shade. Wildlife love beech. The larger a beech gets, it can tend to get hollow on the inside. Just what they do. Doesn't mean they're any more of a weak tree than the other, but just the larger they get, and they're not as hard as other species of trees. Right now there is a few issues with the beech. Beech bark disease is one, which I'm not really seeing too much on these two. And there's another one you may have heard of. It's beech leaf disease. It's kind of picking up more traction. There's really no way of fixing beech leaf disease right now, and they really don't know much about it. It's a bacteria and a nematode, and separately they're fine, but together they're not, or some sort. There's a lot of research on it, and it affects the beech by damaging the leaves, and it can kill what we're seeing in other states. It can kill a beech relatively quickly in like the sapling sizes. And the indicator for beech leaf disease, which I'm not seeing on this tree, if you have a leaf, this is a beech leaf. So in between the mid veins of the leaf, it'll turn really dark, almost black or dark green. It looks like zebra stripes. And the best way to see it is from looking up under the leaf into the sun. Now there are some other diseases like anthracnose. This guy has some anthracnose, which is just a fungus. Usually not harmful for the tree unless it's a really bad infestation over a couple years. But some of the browning that you're seeing where it's really dark brown, it looks like the leaf is crinkling, that's just anthracnose showing. It stays in the leaf litter, comes and goes. Not a huge concern unless it's repeated year after year. Usually the really wet years, because it's a fungus, it's a lot worse. All the different oaks and trees have different kind of lifespans. Also, size does not mean a tree is old. You can have trees that are this big, that are the same age as a tree that's this big. So trees need sunlight, nutrients, water, and one that everybody always forgets or never learns is space. If a tree doesn't have the space to grow that it needs, it will stay smaller. So space is a huge factor in how trees are big. I have a lot of landowners say, this is like a 300 or 400-year-old tree, look at the size of it. And I'm like, not necessarily. You know, there's a lot of factors that come into play with trees for sure. So when I was talking about the euonymus, the burning bush and the frills, this is what I was talking about. Sweet gum has that. It's like, I kind of think of it as like feathers on an arrow in a way. So you can see it in spots. Here's another one. So that's what I was talking about when I meant frills. So it's just a part of the bark that grows like that.
And then after a period of time, it gets a little more dinosaur looking.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. What is this?
Sweet gum.
Sweet gum.
Liquid amber.
Styrofoam fluid.
Yeah. Yep.
Liquid amber styrofoam. And a lot of people know these by the ball. They have a spiky ball that, let me see, I can show you one. And a lot of people hate them because they fall down. You know, if you live in Media and you go to next to the credit union, that street that goes down there are a couple of them, and they just drop their balls. Here's that ball.
Yeah.
Right.
This is one that I always, when I'm like looking at grants and they want to plant trees, they always have this on the list, which is great, but it's where they want to put it. This is the tree. You do not want this on a street. You do not want it on a trail because of the fruit. So it's like a right tree, right place is a huge thing that we talk about as far as urban settings and things. So this is kind of fine right here. This is a wood setting. You're going to expect some stuff. But this on a bike trail, not good. So, but they're a wonderful tree. Trees will always get rid of the excess things they don't need because it's a waste of their resources. Some trees do better at that than others. So pin oak and scarlet oak tend to hold their branches. They're not really good self-pruners. So oak, red oak, white oak, black oak, they'll drop their lower branches because they don't need them. They'll drop them pretty quickly. Or pin oak and especially scarlet oak will retain their lower branches for a really long time. So scarlet oak, you'll find it on the very tops of mountains. It's very scraggly, doesn't grow super straight. But they don't prune as well as they should. Trees don't heal their wounds, they compartmentalize around them. So say I was like cut a hole out of this tree, it's not gonna fill in that hole, it's just gonna grow bark around it to seal that off and prevent it from spreading. But usually when you get holes and things like this at the bottom, it's some sort of either root damage or somebody with a four-wheeler or something came by or things like that. And this is a red maple, so yeah, I just thank you guys for being so great today. So
Thank you.
it was wonderful.